In 1921, the United States Navy, the ferry companies, and most of the American engineering establishment agreed on a single point. The mile of open water where San Francisco Bay collides with the Pacific Ocean could not be bridged. The tides there ran past 6 knots. The channel fell more than 300 feet to the seabed. The wind crossed 60 miles an hour. The fog swallowed the headlands for days, and the San Andreas fault sat roughly 8 miles away. One man submitted a drawing anyway. They called it a rat trap. They would mock him for the better part of a decade. And the name of the engineer who actually made the bridge possible would be quietly removed from the record before the first car ever crossed. This is the story of the Golden Gate Bridge and of Joseph Strauss. To understand why the bridge seemed impossible, you have to stand on the San Francisco headlands in the early 20th century and look north toward Marin. Between the two shores lies the Golden Gate, the narrow strait named long before any bridge, the channel that connects the bay to the ocean. For the city behind it, that water was a wall. The only way across was by ferry. The Southern Pacific Railroad ran the boats, charged $1 for a car, and a crossing could take 20 to 30 minutes when the weather allowed it, longer when it did not. San Francisco in those years was one of the great cities of the American West, and it was hemmed in by its own geography. To grow north, it had to cross the gate. Every serious engineer who studied the problem came back with the same verdict. The combination of depth, current, wind, and fog made a bridge there one of the most hostile construction sites ever proposed. Some argued that even if you could build it, the next earthquake would take it down. The Golden Gate was the last great unbridged water on the Pacific coast, and the consensus held that it would stay that way. Joseph Behrman Strauss did not look like the man who would prove them wrong. He was born in Cincinnati in 1870, the son of a painter and a pianist. A small man who stood barely over 5 feet. At the University of Cincinnati he graduated in 1892, and the record from those years already shows the contradiction that would define him. He was elected both class president and class poet. He was an engineer who wrote verse, a builder who dreamed in scale. His graduate thesis proposed a railroad bridge 55 miles long across the Bering Strait, connecting 2 continents. It was the work of a young man with no sense of the impossible. After graduation, he went into bridge building, and he built a career on a specific and humble structure, the bascule drawbridge, the kind that lifts to let boats pass. Through his Strauss Bascule Bridge Company in Chicago, he put up roughly 400 of them, most over rivers and inland channels, practical and unglamorous. Here is the paradox at the center of everything that follows. The man who would build the longest and tallest suspension bridge in the world had never designed a suspension bridge in his life. In 1917, the city engineer of San Francisco, Michael O'Shaughnessy, began asking a question that most authorities had stopped asking. Could the gate be bridged? And what would it cost? The estimates he received ran as high as $100 million, a figure so large it ended the conversation before it started. But O'Shaughnessy kept asking, and Strauss kept listening, and in 1921 Strauss delivered an answer in the form of a design. It was a hybrid, a heavy cantilever truss reaching out from each shore with a short suspension span hung between them. Strauss claimed it could be built for a fraction of the $100 million estimate. The engineering world looked at the drawing, and the public looked at the drawing, and the reaction was close to unanimous. It was ugly. Critics called it a hideous upside-down rat trap of girders and cables, a steel monstrosity bolted across one of the most beautiful natural settings in the country. The design that was supposed to win the city over instead handed Strauss's opponents their first weapon. The mockery began here, and it did not let up for years. What kept the bridge alive through that ridicule was not Strauss the designer. It was Strauss the promoter. He understood something most engineers never grasp, that a bridge is built twice. First in the minds of the people who must pay for it, and only then in steel. So he went to war for it. Later he summed up the campaign in a single line. It took 2 decades and 200 million words to convince the people the bridge was feasible, and only 4 years and $35 million to put the concrete and steel together. The opposition was enormous and it came from every direction. The land on both sides of the strait belonged to the War Department, which controlled the Presidio and the old fortifications at Fort Point, and the military worried that a bridge could obstruct navigation or be bombed into the channel and trap the fleet. The ferry interests tied to the Southern Pacific filed lawsuits to protect a business that a bridge would destroy. Scenic preservationists, including voices from the Sierra Club, argued that a span across the gate would desecrate the landscape, and a steady chorus of engineers signed statements insisting the thing simply could not stand. Strauss answered all of it. He testified, he lobbied, he barnstormed the northern counties, and in 1923 the California legislature passed the act that created the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District, the public body that could finally make the bridge real. The district was incorporated in 1928. After more than a decade of argument, the project had a legal shape. What it did not yet have was a design that would actually work. That problem fell to a quiet professor named Charles Ellis, and this is where the legend and the record begin to diverge. Strauss knew his own limits. He had built drawbridges, not suspension spans, and he lacked the advanced credentials to satisfy the elite engineers now scrutinizing the project. So he assembled a board of consultants, and the most important of them were Leon Moisseff, the brilliant suspension theorist who had worked on the Manhattan Bridge, and Charles Ellis, a structural engineering professor with a gift for the mathematics the others found tedious. In August of 1929, an expert panel that included Moisseff reviewed Strauss's bulky design and rejected it. It was too heavy, too crude, and too ugly for the site. Strauss turned to Ellis and, by Ellis's own account, gave him some pencils and a pad of paper and told him to go to work. What Ellis produced over the next 2 years changed everything. Working in constant telegraphic contact with Moisseff, he applied Moisseff's deflection theory, the then radical idea that a suspension bridge should not be rigid but should flex, bending with wind and temperature and load, distributing stress through movement rather than resisting it through mass. The result was a lighter, leaner, all-suspension bridge with slender steel towers, the graceful form the world now recognizes. The objections to Strauss's rat trap dissolved in the light of Ellis's elegant design. The bridge that would be celebrated as Strauss's triumph was, in its essential engineering, being calculated on Charles Ellis's desk. Remember that, because the record was about to be rewritten. First, the bridge needed money, and the timing could not have been worse. In November of 1930, the voters of 6 counties, San Francisco, Marin, Sonoma, Del Norte, Mendocino, and part of Napa, were asked to approve a $35 million bond to finance construction. The country was sinking into the Great Depression. Unemployment in San Francisco would climb past 25%. And yet these counties voted to back the bonds with their own homes, their farms, and their businesses, pledging their property against a bridge that the experts still called a gamble. It was an extraordinary act of civic faith in the depths of an economic collapse. Even then, the bonds nearly went unsold, until A.P. Giannini, the founder of Bank of America, agreed to buy them, reportedly saying the bridge was something the region needed and that his bank would take them. The Depression, which should have killed the project, instead made it buildable. Labor was desperate and abundant. Steel mills hungry for orders cut their prices. The bridge would be raised by men who needed the work more than they feared the height. If you value engineering history told straight from the record, the Megaproject Archives is built for you. Subscribe and stay with the build, because the record turns dark here. In November of 1931, with the design essentially complete, Strauss fired Charles Ellis. The stated reason was that Ellis was spending too much, in particular on the endless telegrams to Moisseff, and taking too long with his calculations. Strauss told him to take a vacation and hand his work to an assistant. What Ellis did next reveals how completely the bridge had consumed him. Unable to find other engineering work in the depths of the Depression, and unwilling to walk away from the calculations that were his life's great achievement, he kept working without pay. He put in 70-hour weeks at his own expense, filling roughly 10 volumes with hand calculations that would guide the construction. His former subordinate, Clifford Payne, was installed in his place and would see the bridge through to completion. Ellis returned to academia, by accounts heartbroken, and Strauss began the steady work of claiming the bridge as his own. When Strauss issued his final report, Ellis's name was systematically removed from it. The man who had done the core design would for decades appear nowhere in the official story. The debt the bridge owed him was real, and it would go unpaid for 70 years. On January 5, 1933, after 16 years of argument, the building finally began, and the strait immediately reminded everyone why it had been feared. The North Tower, on the Marin side, rose without great difficulty from a foundation set on a rock ledge close to shore. The South Tower was a nightmare. It had to be planted in open ocean, more than 1,000 feet from the San Francisco shore, in water around 100 feet deep, exposed to the full force of the Pacific and the racing tide. To build a foundation there, the crews first ran a trestle out from shore, then constructed an enormous watertight enclosure, a cofferdam large enough to contain a football field so they could pump it dry and pour concrete on the seabed. The ocean fought them the entire way. Storms battered the access trestle, and a ship even collided with it, forcing the men to rebuild what the sea had broken. Currents tore at the works. For months, the South Pier swallowed time and money and tested whether the bridge could be founded at all. It held. The two great piers were set, and the towers began to climb. What rose from them redefined the skyline of the bay. Each tower climbed to 746 feet above the water, taller than the Washington Monument, slender steel frames that seemed too thin to carry what was coming. By 1935, the towers stood complete, and the work moved to the cables. And this was where the scale became almost difficult to comprehend. The two main cables would be spun in place, strand by strand, by traveling spinning wheels that carried wire back and forth across the gate like spiders weaving a web between the towers. In total, the cables would hold roughly 80,000 miles of pencil-thin steel wire, enough to circle the Earth more than 3 times, bundled and compacted into 2 cables a yard thick. Day after day, the spinning wheels crossed the strait, and the cables thickened. And the impossible bridge took on the shape that Ellis had drawn. But suspended in the air above that cold water, with the deck still to be hung, the work had reached its most dangerous phase, and the question of who would survive it now moved to the center of the story. Here Strauss made the decision that, more than any calculation, defined his character. In the bridge building of the 1930s, death was treated as a fixed cost. The accepted rule of thumb was 1 worker killed for every $1 million spent. By that arithmetic, a $35 million bridge was expected to kill around 35 men. Strauss refused to accept it. He spent roughly $130,000, a fortune at the time, to string an enormous safety net beneath the entire length of the deck, the first time such a net had been used on a project like this. He mandated hard hats when almost no one wore them, ordered glare-free goggles and special diets against dizziness, and enforced discipline with a hard edge. One worker recalled that a man only had to stand out on the steel showing off, on 1 foot, and Strauss would have him fired. The net worked. Over the course of construction, 19 men fell from the bridge and dropped into it instead of into the bay, and lived. They formed an unofficial society and gave it a grim, grateful name. They called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club. For most of the build, against every expectation, Strauss's bridge ran with an almost perfect safety record. And then, weeks from the finish, the net met something it could not hold. The first death had come earlier, on October 21st, 1936, when a worker named Kermit Moore was killed by a falling derrick. For months, He was the only one. Then, on the morning of February 17th, 1937, a stripping platform that crews used to remove concrete forms broke loose from the underside of the deck. It fell, and it fell directly into the safety net, carrying the men who had been working on it. The weight and the force were too much. The net tore from its mountings and dropped most of those men into the strait far below. Of the workers thrown into the net that morning, only 2 survived. 10 men died. With Kermit Moore, the bridge had taken 11 lives. Strauss had beaten the era's brutal standard by a wide margin, sparing perhaps 24 men who by the old arithmetic should have died. But that was no comfort to the families of the 10 who fell when the net gave way, weeks before the work was done. The bridge that was about to be celebrated as a triumph had been paid for, in the end, with their lives. On May 27, 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge opened. The first day belonged to the people. An estimated 200,000 of them walked across the deck before any car was allowed on it. Some running, some on roller skates, one man crossing on stilts. A crowd pouring across the gate that San Francisco had been told for a generation it could never close. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt pressed a telegraph key in the White House, and the bridge opened to traffic. The final accounting silenced the men who had signed the statements of impossibility. The bridge had been estimated, at the high end, at $100 million. It was built for $35 million. It came in roughly $1.3 million under budget, and it was finished ahead of schedule. Its main span of 4,200 feet was the longest of any suspension bridge in the world, a record it would hold for 27 years. Joseph Strauss, the small man with the rat-trap drawing, the dreamer San Francisco had mocked for a decade, stood vindicated before the whole country. He marked the moment the way he had begun, as a poet, reading verse he had written for the occasion, a poem called The Mighty Task is Done. In it he wrote of the bridge being damned by 1,000 hostile sneers, and of those who stood alone when faith was low. He had, by his own measure, answered every one of them. The vindication came at a cost to the man himself. For his work on the bridge, Strauss received roughly $1 million and a lifetime pass to cross it. A statue of him was placed at the San Francisco approach, where it still stands, naming him the chief engineer, the father of the bridge. But the long campaign had emptied him. He was exhausted, his health broken by the years of strain. He left to recover, and he did not recover. Joseph Strauss died in 1938, barely a year after the bridge opened. The opening had been, as one account put it, the last mighty task of his life. He went to his grave as the celebrated builder of the Golden Gate, the legend secure, the statue in place. And the record he left behind was incomplete, because of the name he had taken out of it. Charles Ellis lived on, and for the rest of his life he watched the bridge he had designed be credited to another man. He died in 1949, still absent from the official story. The correction came slowly, and it came too late for him to see it. In 1977, the American Society of Civil Engineers named both Ellis and Leon Moisseiff among the engineers of record for the Golden Gate Bridge. A first acknowledgement that the design had not sprung from Strauss alone. In 1986, the writer John van der Zee published a history called The Gate, drawing on Ellis's own papers to set the record straight and show how much of the bridge had been Ellis's work. The calculations themselves survived, preserved as the Charles Ellis papers in the archives at Purdue University. 10 volumes of evidence in his own hand. And finally, in May of 2007, on the 70th anniversary of the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge District issued a formal report on its stewardship and did something it had refused to do as recently as 1994. It gave Charles Ellis major credit for the design of the suspension bridge that the world sees and cherishes. The district held its press conference beneath the statue of Strauss. 70 years after the ribbon was cut, the name that had been removed was finally written back in. So there are 2 vindications in this story, and the bridge holds them both. Joseph Strauss was proved right against a world that called his bridge impossible, and he built it under budget, ahead of schedule, on a foundation in open ocean, in the depths of the Great Depression. And Charles Ellis was proved right against the man who erased him, his calculations standing as the true frame of the most beautiful suspension bridge ever built. Strauss willed the Golden Gate into being. Ellis made the steel hold. The strait that every authority said could never be crossed has now carried more than 2 billion vehicles, and it still stands above that violent water, fearing neither war, nor time, nor storm, exactly as the poet who built it promised. Both men are gone. The work outlived them, and now at last it carries both their names. American engineering, told as the record actually shows it. Subscribe to the Megaproject archives.